A man named Joseph Lovin eased his wagon off the Morganton Road and rolled to a stop near Rattlesnake Knob. Two neighbors climbed down behind him, still half laughing at the trouble they'd taken for what they called a campfire tale. Lovin didn't argue. He shut off the engine, stepped into the gravel, and held up his pocket watch so they could see the hands. If the light came, it tended to come on time. The three of them faced the dark outline of Brown Mountain. Lovin told them to keep their eyes low, just above the horizon, and not to blink at the wrong moment. One neighbor muttered that if anything rose up out there, he'd be gone before it finished rising. Lovin let him talk. People didn't believe you until the light made a liar out of them. When the minute hand reached the mark, a small red ball appeared above the lower slope, distinct and clean-edged, not smeared like a reflection and not scattered like a distant town. It lifted as if it were climbing from behind the ridge, wavered for less than a minute, and then snapped out. The sound that followed wasn't a scream or a prayer. It was the kind of silence men make when they've run out of jokes. One neighbor finally said flatly, "Do it again." Lovin didn't look at him. He reset his gaze on the ridge and waited, because the light was never a one-time thing. It returned later, and then again, enough times and on enough nights to make you doubt your own eyes right up until it happened. In the communities around Burke County, word moved from families to store counters to church steps. People started making night drives to overlooks, bringing field glasses and children they hoped would remember it later. They argued over what they were seeing. Some described a single light, fiery red, appearing in roughly the same part of the horizon. Others claimed there were multiple lights, different colors, drifting, splitting, or flaring and dying too fast to track. At that distance, across broken ridgelines and deep gaps, even a steady light could seem to lift or hover when the ground beneath it wasn't visible. A newspaper story filed from Linville Falls put the reports into print with details that sounded like testimony. It described a distinct ball rising with punctual regularity, appearing in the early evening and again later at night, visible in all seasons, and going out in less than a minute. That kind of language gave the mystery a backbone. Outsiders began showing up, and locals who'd been embarrassed to talk about the lights suddenly felt licensed to insist on them. The ridge became a destination, and the crowd itself became part of the phenomenon, people watching together, reacting together, then retelling what they'd seen with every nervous addition that retellings tend to collect. Soon, the question reached men with titles. North Carolina Congressman Edwin Yates Webb asked for federal attention, and the United States Geological Survey sent an employee named D.B. Sterrett to observe. Sterrett stayed only a few days, and when he left, he offered an answer that felt too ordinary for a story people were already building. He believed the lights were locomotive headlights, train beams powerful enough to be seen from neighboring heights, appearing to rise when the base of the beam was hidden by terrain and distance. To some listeners, that explanation sounded like an insult, as if the government had come all that way just to tell them they couldn't tell a train from a mystery. Then a destructive flood damaged rail lines and disrupted train traffic in the region for weeks. Word spread that the lights had still been seen. Whether every report from that period was accurate didn't matter to the legend hardening in real time. For many, the flood became proof that Sterrett's conclusion couldn't cover everything. The lights stayed in conversation, and the more they were talked about, the more people came out to look, hoping to be the one who finally saw them clearly enough to settle the argument. By the early 20s, the Brown Mountain Lights were famous enough to bring federal pressure back again. Senators from North Carolina urged the Geological Survey to take a second, more thorough look. That assignment went to George R. Mansfield, a geologist who arrived with maps, instruments, and the temperament of someone who wasn't there to be dazzled. He did not come to argue with stories. He came to watch the same horizon and record what happened with enough precision that his notes could be checked by someone who'd never met him. Mansfield spent 2 weeks in March and April observing on 7 evenings, sometimes staying until after midnight. He chose hillsides with wide views and returned to places locals insisted were reliable. He noted where each light appeared on the horizon and compared those directions to the geography in front of him and to known routes in the distance. He took help from local men who knew the ridges and hollows by memory, not to take their word for what the lights were, but to make sure he was standing where long-time observers stood and looking where they looked. The answers came as a set of matches, not a single dramatic reveal. Some lights lined up with rail corridors, appearing in ways consistent with a powerful headlamp rounding a bend and then disappearing when the beam slipped behind terrain. At miles of distance, a train moving on a grade could make a fixed light seem to rise above the mountain itself. Other lights aligned with roads, their brightness and color shifting as vehicles turned, dipped, or crested, turning steady headlights into brief flares. Mansfield also considered brush fires, which could create stationary glows that looked unnatural when they appeared where the eye expected empty darkness. What many people called one light, he treated as multiple sources producing similar effects from far away, in a landscape that hid the ground but left the glow. When Mansfield's conclusions were released to the press, the explanation sounded plain because it was plain. The Brown Mountain Light, he argued, was not one single source. Different observers at different points were likely seeing different kinds of lights and folding them into one story. That was why one witness swore it was a red ball, another swore it was several, and a third swore it moved like something alive. The ridge wasn't changing personalities. People were combining separate observations under one name, then carrying the name forward as if it guaranteed a single cause. Even then, the story didn't end. People kept going to Brown Mountain. Some nights they saw nothing and left irritated, convinced the mountain had gone quiet. Other nights they caught a light and felt the same jolt Lovin's neighbors had felt on that roadside, an instant of certainty that they were seeing something that shouldn't be there. Over time, new claims attached themselves to the older reports, while the early 20th century sightings remained the ones most clearly tied to documented investigations. What can be said with confidence is narrower, and it's enough. For more than a century, people have reported lights along that ridge, and at key moments, those reports drew formal attention. Federal observers went to the mountain, watched what witnesses described, and concluded the sources were ordinary. Trains, vehicles, and fires viewed across complex terrain. The phenomenon persists because a light that appears, wavers, and dies above a dark ridge still hits the human brain like a message, even when the source is something mechanical moving through the night far beyond the slope. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.